You're listening to the Digital Child Podcast, brought to you by the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child.
Video games have been a popular hobby for young children since electronic games became mainstream in the 1970s. While the video games I played as a child are a lot different to the ones children are playing today, questions around how gameplay affects children's health and well-being have always been a point of debate among parents, health professionals, policymakers, and scholars. Decades of research have explored possible links between video games and health and well-being outcomes. And as gameplay continues to rise as a form of recreation for young children, some as young as 1 or 2 years of age these days, robust evidence and understanding in this field has never been more critical. I'm Sue Bennett, Deputy Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child and host of this Digital Child podcast episode. Today, we're speaking with Professor Daniel Johnson, a Chief Investigator in the Centre who's leading a research project in partnership with the LEGO Group and UNICEF that will help understand and optimise the impact of video games on the well-being of children. Welcome to the podcast, Daniel.
Thanks, Sue. Very happy to be here.
So before we start talking about the project, tell us a bit about your research background and what you're interested in.
That's a great question. My background's a bit of an unusual one, I think, in some ways, in that I started out in psychology and somehow ended up in computer science. But in another way, it does make sense in that my interest at the start of my career was really in mental health and well-being, and that was my early focus. And then I drifted into, I've always had a passion for technology, and I think that informed my departure into computer science. And then that pretty quickly narrowed into a focus on the impacts of technology on people's well-being. And I guess most of my work to date has been with adults, and it's been really exciting to start to extend that focus to children as well more recently, and start to think about what things might be the same and what things might be different when we think about the impacts of technology for children.
So that's a perfect segue in what we're going to focus on in our conversation today. So the Responsible Innovation in Technology for Children project, or RITEC for short, is a partnership with the LEGO Group and UNICEF. You're leading the team that's looking at the impact of video games on children's well-being. Before we get into the details of the research, can you tell us why this project's important and how it came about?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, so I think, in some ways, the reason it's so important is exactly sort of foreshadowed in my previous answer, right? Like, we know a lot in the field about how video games impact adults and young people, but we know relatively less about how video games impact children. And that's a big motivator. LEGO are working in partnership with UNICEF on this project. For both those groups, it's really important to understand, for UNICEF, they're focused on children's well-being in many settings. And for LEGO, they really are determined to be doing good in the world and not to inadvertently do harm. And they now have a real focus on video games, where you and I, and maybe I still do, play with plastic blocks and build things. LEGO now have a huge area of their focus, which is video games, and probably a lot of parents and certainly children out there be familiar with those games. LEGO are very keen to understand, to be clear, to be sure that the games they're building are having a positive impact and to avoid inadvertently causing any harm. But also I'm just going to acknowledge that we're in the middle of a thunderstorm where I am at the moment, which I think is quite fitting given all the fear and doom and gloom some people have around video games. So just imagine it as cleverly placed ambience for the conversation we're having. But there really is a very sincere desire on both parties, and ours as well, to understand these impacts. And LEGO want just not to make sure that the games that they build are having a positive impact, but also to be able to equip designers and developers of video games with the tools they need to sort of build from the ground up a more positive experience for children.
So in my introduction, I alluded to the fact there's been a lot of work done already in games and gaming. You and I have both done research on this in the past. What do you feel is what's different about this project compared to some of that other work that's been done already?
Oh, okay. So let me first talk about the theory, and then I'll rabbit on to a little bit about the methods that we're using as well. I think what we understand quite clearly with adults in terms of video game play is that for the vast majority of adults, video games have a positive influence. And even if you talk to the most concerned and negative researchers in the field, that they won't talk to you about a problem in greater than 5 or 6% of the population. A lot of us think that it's a bit less than that, but a smaller component of the adult population aren't likely to have any problematic play. And what our work's found and what others have found in the field is that it's very unlikely in most cases to be video games that are the problem per se. And what I mean by that is that we do a lot of work with a theory called self-determination theory, and that's a really well-loved theory in a number of fields, sport, education, work, but also in video games. And it talks about how things that we want to do for their own sake, things that we're intrinsically motivated to do, tend to be things that satisfy our need for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Video games are really good at doing that. They really do a great job of making you feel like you've done a good job. They have oodles of freedom to do what you want in them. And all of our work and those of others, and we found this almost by accident, kept pointing to the social benefit of video game play. There's a huge amount of benefit for connecting with others through video games, whether that's while you play or, around the water cooler or in the playground talking about your favourite game. So games are great at doing that. And what we found is that for most people, they'll lead to positive outcomes for wellbeing, but not always. And the interesting thing to note is that it's not when you can reliably predict a negative outcome for someone or a greater likelihood of a negative outcome for someone, which is still with adults, is when they're not having their needs satisfied in the rest of their lives. So if video games are making you feel good, that's great, with the qualifier that hopefully you're getting that sort of feeling in your relationships or at work, or in some other settings in your life. You have another hobby as well, or work's going well. It doesn't really matter. But where the problem may arise is if video games are the only place that you're getting those needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness satisfied. In those situations, we're more likely to see your interest in video games become a little bit more obsessive and a little bit less harmonious. And all that's really well established with adults. We've had less opportunity to explore that with children, but it seems likely that similar patterns would be in play. I will add that we've also found that in addition to passion, self-regulation is a key predictor for adults for a good outcome with video game play. And I think that's a great jumping off point for what we're exploring with children, because children aren't born with the ability to self-regulate. We develop that skill. And certainly in the conversations we have with parents, self-regulation seems to be at the crux of a lot of the tension that arises. It's around negotiating, finishing a play session or taking a break. And so that's one of the areas we're really keen to focus on in our work.
So you've talked about, exploring these areas. If you could, pick what you think is your main goal, what it is that you're really trying to achieve for this project, what would that be? What is it that we need to understand more? And what is it that we would understand coming away from this project?
Great question. I think building off what I was talking about, part of it's about better identifying what are the features of the games that are going to satisfy those needs in children, and what are the features that might take a healthy, harmonious interest into an obsessive interest. I think we all know that we're probably going to end up soon with a situation where video games that are made for children won't have loot boxes in them. Now, that's just one example of an easy no. They have features that, if not problematic, definitely questionable, and that research is slowly building too. So those are an easy no. But there are other things that are maybe less clearly, it's less clearly obvious, because the tricky thing about video games is they're so good at making us feel that way that we do want to play them more. And so identifying what are the things that are kind of encouraging a healthy engagement with the child versus what are the things that maybe are not so great. That's one of the things we really want to get to on the project. And I know it's what motivates LEGO as well. They're really keen to get to kind of, we've talked a lot about game mechanics, which are the different ways you can play a game, the activities you do in the game, or different game features. It's going to take a while to get to that level of understanding. But maybe it's a good point for me to circle back to the other thing that's unique about this project, which is the method that we're using. So a lot of the work that exists, there's not a great deal of work with children in video games, and there are various reasons for that. There's some, but we're still building the body of work we need to sort of be confident about any sort of broad generalizations we might make. But in this project, there's a few features that make it unique. We've asked children to come into the lab and play 2 video games, and while they're playing, we've had sensors on them that measure their heart rate and galvanic skin response, and we've also tracked where they're looking on screen, as well as a webcam which is able to make very fine and accurate judgments of their facial expression while they're playing. And the great thing about that is that we're not relying on their recall. So one of the tricky things about studying video games is you ask people to play for an hour and then you say, how was it? What did you like? And there are all sorts of insights you can make with that, but there are also limitations, right? Like, do you remember what you were doing 40 minutes ago? The more involved you get in the video game, the less able you are to communicate what's going on to someone who's watching. If you get into concepts like flow, as soon as you ask someone, are you in flow, they're not in flow anymore. So there's all sorts of challenges like that, whereas this gets around that a little bit in that we can get real-time, more objective data. And I'm not saying purely objective data because I think it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that biometric data like that is, a gold standard, and it's not. If we see a spike in heart rate, we still need to understand, is that spike in heart rate excitement, fear, joy? So we're doing that, and I think one of the really cool things about this project is we have a visit 1 where they interact with the games and we take those measurements. And then in visit 2, we show them what was happening with that data. So we show them their heart rate at different points in the game. We show them their facial expression and what the software thought their facial expression reflected. And we ask them, what do you think might have been going on in that moment? We get them to look at what was happening in the game and review it and help us interpret the data, which has been absolutely fascinating.
And as you've been conducting these sessions, I know it's very early on. Can you share with us some of the initial findings or some of your preliminary observations?
Yeah, with all the caution you'd expect a fellow academic to have around that sort of question, Sue.
Of course.
I think it's easier to talk about one of the really interesting things, and we sort of thought this would be the case, but it's been fascinating how true it's been, is that the biometric data, there are some negative connotations with that term, as we've learned along the way in the project. And, I think it's important to say this is not data like the biometrics they might use at an airport to track who's going where. It's just a name for psychophysiological data that, refers to signals from your body. And what we found is that the psychophysiological data, the biometric data, is really useful and interesting, but it's so much more interpretable through the lens of what the child's doing in the game, through the interviews we conducted with the children, and through their interpretations of the data. So, as I sort of alluded to earlier, we might see a small smile at a certain point in the game, and we could theorize that that's due to the fact that it's sometimes really obvious, like they just kicked a goal. But other times it's not as obvious. And there's been some really interesting insights that have come out of that, where, the opposing team kicked a goal and we said, well, try what was going on there? And they were like, I was just really happy that we were going to have a good competition and that something nice was going to happen. Or really, they were playing one of the games with another person, and there was some really wonderful kind of moments of generosity and kindness happening between the children, who might have been in some cases strangers. And so there were interesting insights around that to do with, feeling like I was happy for the other person that they were able to get a bit better at the game, or those sorts of things. So I guess the broad headline is we've been really impressed with what we can learn from the psychophysiological data, but particularly in the context of the child's interpretation of it. And also that not everything was obvious to us. It's nice to be able to confirm that scoring a goal or completing a puzzle brings a sense of joy or satisfaction, but there's been lots of sort of unexpected moments that were really interesting too, that we wouldn't have been able to predict as well.
So I think that's really interesting in relation to the theory that you've been talking about. So you've talked about self-determination theory and self-regulated learning, which are both theories that I've also used before. And I think one of the things that I like about it and like to remind myself of is that these are not people aren't self-determined in every context. This is very much about the kind of experience that they're having. And just to pick up on a point that you made earlier, it seemed like one of the things that you're interested in exploring is not just the child's experience of the game and the design of the game, but in fact, what contextual setting that experience is in. Can you talk a little bit more about, how you're seeing investigating that and why it might be important to have this understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a nice sort of segue into broader work that we're doing or will be doing soon. Because with the Lego project, they've got multiple partners working on it, and our piece of the puzzle is very much in a laboratory setting, which, to answer your question in one way, is quite limited, right? So some of them came in with a sibling, some of them were paired with a stranger. They're sitting in a room with equipment attached to them, with a bunch of middle-aged researchers standing around and talking to them. It's not the same as playing at home. And in fact, that's one of the things we're really keen to get stuck into at the centre. We've got a paper with this interesting line that it's been in my head a lot lately, which is what you play and how much you play is far less important than who you play with and why you play. And so I think we'll find that very much to be the case with children. For some children, for many children, we know that this is for them the equivalent of what rugby might be for another child, right? It's a way to connect with your peers. It's a way to work together on something. It's a way to learn teamwork and deal with failure and build resilience. All these things that we have never had a problem ascribing to sport, but that we're only slowly coming to recognise is equally applicable in video games. But the context that you're referencing, I think, will be really important for that. The playing with people that are, reassuring or positive towards you versus playing with a stranger who's toxic and nasty are obviously completely different things. I'm at pains also not to imply that the only good video game players play with others. In the same way as sitting and reading a novel can be really good reflective time. I think the topical example at the moment would be The Last of Us, not appropriate for children, but an example of an incredible storytelling experience that happened through video games that's now being recognised by people through its television show. But some reflective time for a child playing a single player game can be equally important. So those sort of contexts, I think, are absolutely relevant.
And I'm reminded of something that our colleague Michael Dejwani often talks about is that we don't forget the pleasures of technology, that technology, engagement is often about relaxation, and it's not just about the activity itself or, some of those other benefits. Actually, enjoyment of technology isn't end in itself too,
Yes.
and a positive one. If you were to, try to capture in a nutshell what impact you would like this project to have on people's perceptions of gaming and video games in terms of the impact on children, what would you say your ambition is?
That's an easy question. Gosh. I think it's easier to answer that at one level up. I think the Lego project is an example of many projects that I hope overall will provide parents with reassurance. So a lot of my research, in inverted commas, in this space happens at parties, talking to parents and other caregivers about what they think about video games. When they learn what I do, it quickly turns to, should I be worried? And what I generally find is if we talk about the percentages of children who have positive experience or else have positive experience versus percentages who don't, and you ask a few questions about, does it look to you like your child's having a positive experience when they're playing? Almost always the answer is yes. It looks like they're connecting with their friends. They seem happy. I just feel like I should be worried because of everything I hear in the media. And I think part of what I'd love to achieve in projects like this is not just reassurance of parents that if you're not seeing disharmony and problems, then you don't need to believe it's going to be there. If it looks good, it almost certainly is good. But also to build more of a sense of how you can maximise the chances of it being a positive experience, and also the things to watch out for, which we haven't really touched on, and I'm happy to sort of, we can or cannot go there as you prefer. But I think broadly reassurance and helping to sort of guide, I think we all know not to buy our children Grand Theft Auto. I think what is more... what's a more difficult problem for us to tackle at the centre through projects like this is, what are some effective techniques for helping teach your child to self-regulate around this stuff. If you are having a disagreement about when it's time to stop, how might you approach that? Those sorts of things.
And I think to go back to an earlier point you made, what else might be going on?
Yeah.
So how might we understand this negative engagement with gameplay as actually being not to do with the game or playing the game, but actually there's something else going on? And I think to recognise that, what can be fun one day, on another day when something else is going on is a negative experience. So it goes back to that, what's going on in the context, what's going on at this time for your child. So Daniel, as a sort of final question, I know that you are an avid gamer yourself still. Tell us about what your favourite games were when you were a child and how that has changed as you've grown up.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
Yeah, the last part I'm going to pick you up on, but the rest of it seemed legitimate. I think one of the things that I observed, gaming has always, for me, fulfilled so many different roles. But, to simplify greatly and pick back up on something we were talking about, some of the time gaming for me is a solo activity. It's very reflective and restorative, so much so that my partner will sometimes suggest that what I need to do is go away and play some video games so I can become a better human again. And I think that speaks to the restorative kind of reflective aspect of it. But it's always been a very social thing for me too. And one of the things that one of the most interesting technology changes, I think the obvious stuff is the visuals have changed, the price has changed, but what's been interesting for me is the degree to which social connectivity has been supported. So, whereas as a young person, I had to invite someone over to sit on the couch with me and we would pass the controller back and forth, which is great. And in fact, I did that last weekend with a close friend and can still highly recommend it. By the time I was in university, we would pick up our very heavy monitors and our very heavy computers, and quite often I would host what we called a LAN, and we would get a switch and we would spend 4 to 5 hours getting 6 computers to talk to each other, another hour or two getting everyone's software updated over the dial-up modem, and then we might play for 2 or 3 hours before it was time to pack up. But that is a social experience, as a means of connecting was great. And now, I connected with some people through a game called Destiny, people who live on the other side of the world who I've now visited multiple times. They've been across to Australia. There are absolutely deep, real, meaningful, intimate friendships, which, is what all the research suggests. But was still somehow surprising to me to build friendships that are just as significant as the ones that I've made through other hobbies or through work or through school, through a video game, and realise how important they were. I think that's the way that I connect with other people through play, and the convenience through which I can do that. I can now maintain a friendship with a good friend in Los Angeles without leaving my home.
Yeah, the wonders of our modern connectivity.
Mm.
Well, thanks, Daniel. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you, Sue.
And thanks so much for joining us today. That's a wrap for today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more on your favourite streaming service or at our website, digitalchild.org.au.